and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. In 1925, the International Exhibition of Modern and Industrial Decorative Arts introduced a new style to the world. It was a design that suited the new machine age, which was a far cry from the flowery Art Nouveau, which was prevalent till then. This was sleek, full of geometric patterns with influences from Africa, Egypt, and Asia. Soon it was everywhere, absorbed into architecture, typography, furniture. Poster art for movies, travel incorporated this new look. And it spread all over the world from New York to Cuba, from Miami to Bombay. Though it was called many things, it was only in the 1960s it got its new name that it is now known by Art Deco. This is the 100th anniversary of Art Deco, and it is being celebrated in Bombay, which has the second largest collection of buildings of that style. It is now experiencing a revival of popularity like never before. To explain this and more importantly, establish its historical context, I invited Mustansir Dalvi, a former professor at Mumbai's JJ School of Architecture. His doctoral research for a PhD from IIT Bombay IDC examines Bombay's Art Deco architecture from a semiotic perspective. Dalvi is the author of many books, including his latest, Citizen Charles, on the first ever biography of architect Charles Correa. More than that, Dalvi is a poet and translator of many books and has translated from Urdu and Marathi into English. He is a consultant to Art Deco Alive, a festival to celebrate the style which is being held in Mumbai at the moment. Mustansir Dalvi, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you, Siddharth. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, first of all, give us some background of how and why this style emerged.
Okay. In its international form, the style emerged because of the exhibition you just mentioned in 1925. And this exhibition was rather unique in the context of what was happening in the Western world at that time, which I mean is primarily Europe and in that general area. Prior to the 20s, right from the middle of the 19th century, it was an age of revivalism in Europe, which meant that contemporary buildings were being built in the style of buildings from centuries past. And that is how you had the revival of architecture that was neoclassical in nature, which meant that it was like the ancient Greeks and Romans. Or you had the architecture that was neo-Gothic in nature, which was in the style of the old cathedrals of the medieval period. Or there were some hybrids of all this and some very eclectic things. And this became the kind of default architectural vocabulary for a very long time. And obviously, in the light of the Industrial Revolution and the generation of new materials, new construction practices and techniques, there was a bit of a backlash to this rather looking back kind of situation. And many styles then emerged that came as a resistance to this. One of the ways in which the resistance was also presented was when this exhibition was set up. And it was set up by a group of what at that time were called decorative artists. You know, they were the people who did the ornamentation of architecture, or ornamentation of furniture, interior design, fabrics, curtains, wallpapers, and so on. So ornamentation and decoration was pretty much something that stood by itself. But they did mention that all the work that will be displayed in this exhibition in Paris should be without precedent, in the sense that it should not be revivalistic in any way. It should have designs that were very original and came from their own time. And many people stood up to the challenge and actually, did the work. So if you look at old images of the work that was displayed in uh, in this exhibition, you see some pretty avant-garde kind of work. You see things that are no longer neoclassical or neo-Gothic, but are, with very original forms, as you mentioned, geometries, very cubist kind of structures. I must mention that two of the architects who participated in this show, in this exhibition, were later on very famous. One was the Russian constructivist Konstantin Melinkov, who is known for very modernist structures, and the other was, of course, Le Corbusier, probably the person who would become the most famous modernist architect in the 20th century. Now, their work and the work of others got taken up, and a lot of people visited the show. And then they took back ideas from this. And then they started to create designs that were no longer rooted in the past. In a sense, this is, in a slow sense, this is how Art Deco started to percolate all over Europe and, of course, then the Americas.
How did it? So people who went there saw that the old was out and the new was emerging, and they shed the old skin and moved on with this new 20th century ideas, and
Yeah.
took them back to Europe, took them back. How did it reach Indian shores?
Uh, it reached Indian shores relatively later, especially, I mean, since in my case, it is, I study architecture and I have written on architecture. Uh, Art Deco, as a practiced architecture on Indian shores, especially in terms of Bombay, reached by around 1935. So it would be about 10 years after the exhibition in Paris. And it reached here, or it started being practiced here for a variety of reasons. Essentially, you have to look at the larger ecosystem in which this emerges. So, what is happening in Bombay at that time is that there is this very interesting shift from being just a port city to becoming a mercantile city. Okay, and in that you have new requirements for work and you new requirements for workers. Essentially, you need now people who are what we call white collar workers. It was not the blue collars who came earlier in an earlier generation to work in the factories and textile mills and so on, but now you needed people to come and work in banks and insurance companies and such other mercantile kind of professions. So that brought in a new wave of migration to the city, and they needed to be housed in a form of building that was not exactly the chawls of the past. So this is one of the things. The second is the fact that Bombay was itself being reshaped through the many reclamations that had started right from the 1920s. Uh, in the 1890s, there was a big plague in Bombay, and that caused a lot of change, especially in the form of governance and planning in the city. There was the setting up of what is called the Bombay Improvement City Improvement Trust, which made a lot of micro planning in different parts of Bombay, creating new land, creating new plots, and having new buildings come up on them. But at the same time, they also reclaimed the sea. So you had this massive project called the Back Bay Reclamations. And there are two phases in which we see the Back Bay Reclamations being completed. One is at the end of the 1920s, and one is at the end of the 1930s. And then what this did was create a lot of new land on which you had very grid-like rational rectangular plots on which new buildings had to come. And these buildings then emerged. A third very important reason for its emergence in Bombay was the slow adoption of a new building material and building technology, which we now popularly know as RCC, that is reinforced cement concrete. This is a completely different paradigm from the buildings that were built earlier, which were built in a what we call load bearing, or essentially the weight of the building is taken by the walls and transferred to the ground. When it is RCC, the load of the building is not taken by the walls, it is taken by the columns and beams and transferred to the ground. So effectively, the walls do not bear the weight, and they can be then manipulated in a variety of ways. You can have very wide windows. You can also, because of RCC, have these beautiful jutting out cantilevered balconies. These eyebrows, which we call chajjas, which are weather protectors for the windows. Or you could even have different shapes, and there you have this very emergence of a very interesting curved kind of form at the corners of buildings and so on. You can have windows which are circular in shape. All these things emerge primarily due to the use of this new technology, which then starts to become very, very easily accessible, easily used, and goes down the ladder of class, in the sense that even people who have much more modest means, middle class and lower middle class, ultimately all start to use the RCC construction. And this RCC is the reason that Art Deco actually explodes, not only in Bombay, but all over the country. And I do not think today you can go to any town, big or small, in the country, and you will say that there is no Art Deco there. It is
In fact,
inevitable that you will find it.
In fact, wasn't there a confluence also? I mean, you explained the historical, the sociological concept, societal concept, white collar workers coming in, the city's profile itself changing. You explained the technical one, which is that new materials came in. But wasn't there something else also happening in the sense that now the citizens of India, especially Bombay, because we are talking of Bombay at the moment, which has a large confluence of this building, that they were prosperous enough to and educated enough to, get together everything from the architect to the financier to the provider of, let's say, furniture, plumbing, tiles, etc. So wasn't that coming together of that situation an ideal kind of virtuous situation?
Well, even you're right, but it's even more than that, because let us accept the fact that Art Deco in its form is actually an international style. Okay. And to a large extent, it is associated, or it got associated very quickly with a kind of high life, especially in the Americas. New York becomes like the hub of upper end Art Deco. The very rich adopt that and so on. When it goes to the peripheries of America, like in a place like Miami, you have an entire waterfront full of hotels that starts to build the hotels in this form of very jaunty, colorful, sculptural Art Deco and so on. And it percolates into Hollywood at the same time. The important thing is that during those times, you're absolutely right. You had a class of people who were educated, and educated in English, who were educated in various skills like, mercantilism, accountancy, lawyers, white collar workers, and things like that, and who were also largely cosmopolitan, in the sense that you had people who were white collar workers coming from different parts of the country into Bombay and starting to find a life over there. And all these people had access to what we call popular culture. They had access to cinema, which was showing the latest of Hollywood at that time. They had access to records, vinyl records, which had the most latest in terms of jazz and swing and those kind of popular styles of music which were emerging, and they had access to written material in the form of magazines, periodicals, film magazines, culture magazines, and so on. This was one, and the more affluent amongst them also traveled the world. This was also a time, say, in a place like Bombay, where 20 years before independence, where most of the 500 odd princely states that were there in the country at that time, those princes and Nawabs and Maharajas actually had homes in Bombay, because that was the place from which they would get onto ships to travel the world. Okay. And when all this kind of comes together with one additional ingredient, I must add, and that is the emerging profession of architecture, of architects. The first kind of generation of architects who were graduating from the School of Architecture in Bombay and setting up their own practices, who were almost mostly Indian, not British, who then set up their practices and started almost collectively to decide that the buildings that they will build will be in RCC and will be of this style, which we call Art Deco. So that was the access. So you are correct in that, but it is more than just that. It is the availability of material that they chose Art Deco. And I think if we ask the question that then why did they do that as opposed to choosing something else, or even say choosing an Indian, so to speak, style of building, the answer I think is the fact that they wanted to be as much at at the forefront of what was happening in the world as any other architect in different parts of the world, because it is this moment where these kind of buildings are actually happening everywhere. In all the cities in the world, especially in the port cities, you start to see the emergence of a building that is not very different from the Art Deco of Bombay. And I have been and seen some of those buildings, and there's a whole variety of images that you still have of buildings in various countries and various port cities that look just like Bombay's buildings. So it's a confluence of all these things.
Mustansir, would you then say that the cosmopolitanism which you refer to, uh, you know, and the access to magazines, the fact that some people may have actually traveled and come back with ideas, come back with those magazines and shown their architect and say, I want this. Some even imported architects in, not in Bombay, but elsewhere. So
Yeah.
was that a kind of given, considering that because of its port city nature, Bombay was very open-minded as a place?
I think so. I very much agree with that, because the kind of movement of people in the city was from a variety of countries abroad, and for a variety of reasons they passed through the city. Each one of them left their own kind of mark. You take music at that time. This was a very prolific period for a lot of jazz musicians to actually land up on the shores of Bombay and perform concerts and so on. And of course, then therefore influence Indian musicians to take up jazz. And Naresh Fernandez has written about this in his wonderful book. So, in the same manner, there would be the influence of architects who came from abroad, painters, artists, and even other, say, just the more affluent, who brought a lot of things with them. See, Art Deco actually permeates, as you mentioned in your introduction, every level of scale, right from graphic design to a skyscraper like the Empire State Building. So, in that, a lot of the kind of objects that came through during that time to India would have made their presence felt, would have been aspired to. Take radios, for example. Okay, radios during that time were these large objects with these big valves in it, which you had to kind of tune to find various stations and all. but they were also objects of delight to look at. They were also made in different materials. So you could have a beautifully carved body of a radio made out of wood, or you could have a very snazzy new radio made out of a material called bakelite, which is a form of plastic. Now these materials also were emerging at that time and becoming more and more popular and more accepted by the people. So so it's that is what's happening. It's that the city, which is a port city, turning into a much more mercantile city, into a city where there are more affluent people uh, on the rise. At least there is a very coherent middle class, plus these upper classes, and as I mentioned, the scions of Maharajas and Nawabs, who also have their place in the city. And when they are in Bombay, you would find them, you know, uh, uh, going to the very fancy shops or the hotels like the Taj and so on, which create an atmosphere or which create a certain ecosystem of of modernity, of contemporary life, and bring people together.
So my
One other, sorry,
sorry,
if
go
I
ahead.
may
Please
just
go ahead.
add one
Please
more
go.
point, would be that look at one building typology that emerges during this period, which to me becomes a kind of symbol of cosmopolitanism, and that is the apartment block. This is a newish kind of building. A block of flats becomes a kind of newish kind of building typology because it differs from the earlier one, which would be the chawl or the wadi. Now, the chawls and the wadis were primarily community housing, in the sense that people from one community would more or less get together, and they would all live in that kind of place, and they would form these little pockets of communities. And we see a lot of them, the remnants of those in places like Kalba Devi, and in Puleshwar and in Dongri, uh, and such places. But in these new buildings which were coming up, both on the new reclaimed lands, as well as further north in places like Dadar Matunga, where you had the Hindu colony and the Parsi colony and so on. But look at, say, the buildings which come on the Oval Maidan or the Marine Drive. They are all individual flats. They also have one very important characteristic, and that is they have what we call ensuite toilets, which are inside the flats and not common like you have in chawls. But the fact is that probably for the first time, you occupied a home where you really did not have a choice of who your neighbor was. So your neighbor could be anyone from any community, from who spoke any language, who could have any caste, who could have any eating habits, and everybody had to come together to live in a cordial kind of way. And that too is an example of the cosmopolitanism that starts to emerge in a city like Bombay at that time.
So, one of the kind of theories that I have imagined, I don't know whether there's any substance to it, is that there is, you're talking of the 1930s, mid to late 1930s, perhaps seeping into the 40s.
Very much
Uh,
so.
and though we don't know when independence is going to come finally, there is a buzz around at that time, because 1939 was the government of uh, I think Maharashtra had a provisional government.
The
uh,
Bombay presidency, yes.
Bombay presidency, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're right, yeah. So there's a sense in the air that something is going to happen. So, my pet theory is that perhaps the Indians at that time, whether financiers or whether the owners of the building, whether the architects, whether the everybody, and seized upon this new style as a way of telling the Raj that We are not interested in your old fashioned grand Gothic buildings that you have made. We want something new. And this is our statement of being, if not independent as a nation, but certainly independent minded. And we are creating this. I'm sure nobody thought about it that way, but do you think, in retrospect, as a theorist, you can look at that at all?
Yes, Siddharth. In fact, I have looked at this in the past. I have examined this for quite a few years. Uh, I also had this idea that can we look at Art Deco actually as a form of resistance? A very overt form of resistance because it occupies the same space that the neo-Gothic buildings and the monumental imperial buildings of the Raj occupy, and kind of is in your face, so to speak. Look at us, we are different, sort of thing. But I have not found any actual citable evidence to this. It's a theory, and as a theory it is attractive. As a theory, I can in fact may even make a case for it. But I can give you one context that kind of tempers this enthusiasm for this theory for me, and that is a very simple thing. uh, by the mid 1920s, the almost all the imperial buildings that were to be built in Bombay had already been built. The last two important buildings that come up in Bombay as part of the imperial project, one is the Prince of Wales Museum, which gets finished by almost the 1920s, and the other is the Gateway of India, which is very overtly imperial. It is a triumphal arch using the architecture of the Gujarat Sultanate, built with concrete in parts, by the way, to commemorate the 1911 visit of the King and Queen to the shores of Bombay. After that, there are no significant buildings of empire that we see in Bombay. However, the entire attention by then goes to Delhi, because that is the time when the Lutyens project has taken off. That is the time where Delhi is becoming New Delhi, and you have Lutyens and Herbert Baker creating the Viceregal Lodge, which is now the Rashtrapati Bhavan. That is what Lutyens does. Baker does the places we now call North and South Block, and so on. And of course, the grand master plan with the King's Way or Rajpath, and so on. So the entire attention of the British in terms of imperial monumentality and expression is now shifting to Delhi. And I think that creates a vacuum in Bombay, which local architects and local patrons very happily fill up. And how do they fill up this vacuum? They fill up the vacuum by choosing an international style that is truly being practiced at that time in so many other cities in the world. So that is my explanation for it, rather than a form of resistance against the British. I mean, maybe at an unconscious level, that is exactly what is happening, because there is, I think, from the 1930 onwards, there is a distinct buzz in the city, and there are, of course, a lot of uh, active acts of resistance in terms of morchas and dharnas and Prabhat ferries and strikes, and a lot of the important leaders of the independence movement pass through India, or they are arrested in India, or they go from Bombay. I mean, pass through Bombay and they are arrested here, and they go to the United Kingdom for the various roundtable conferences and all. So there is a buzz. There is also the sailors' mutiny, which happens during that time.
Well,
So
Quit India
the
movement
Quit
was.
India movement is there. Absolutely right. The do or die call is given from Gwalior tank, if I'm not wrong. And this atmosphere is there, the buzz is there, but the architecture doesn't necessarily parallel that.
Mustansir, I want to ask whether in all this, what was the extent of town planning that was going on in the city? Because that seeing what is happening in Mumbai today, that's a very crucial question. We need to find out whether Bombay, in its heyday of that period, ever had town planning, and what was the town planning that was going on?
In one sense, planning in Bombay starts right from the 1890s when there is a plague and there is therefore a desire to kind of create a situation where such things will not happen again. And to alleviate that, a lot of reorganization of the built form in the city, especially in the more crowded areas, which is called the native town, starts to happen. This both happens in terms of demolishing buildings which are very close together, creating new roads that go through this, bringing in places where a lot of ventilation can happen through the city, allowing the breezes of the city from the sea to kind of blow through the city, and at the same time developing new areas. Now, these new areas develop in two directions. One is they develop north, which means north of the areas which have been not that far back refilled to create the peninsula that is Bombay. By reclaiming all the lands between the original islands, and this is done by laying down railway tracks that allow you to go that much north and to commute to the south. Now, in those areas, you have plans which are now created on the more lands which I think earlier would have been agricultural to a very large extent, and now become places where inhabitation can happen. There are also many other players also come into the picture. Entrepreneurs, people who are already landed, people who have wealth, and so on, and also communities. One example of which is the Parsi community that develops this entire planned precinct in Matunga, which we now call the Dadar Parsi colony. In the same way, there is a Hindu colony which develops, and so on. These are all plans. The second place where plans happen, I mentioned earlier, are in the Back Bay reclamations, which are right there at the south, right in front of the Gothic buildings. You have the Oval Maidan buildings which come up on plots which are reclaimed. And then after the 1930s, you have the beautiful Queen's Necklace or the Marine Drive, on which new land is made available and new buildings come up. At the same time, there are several insertions as well in the existing city. Like, say, for example, there is the Ballard Estate, which comes up right next to the docklands as almost a business district. An entire street is carved out to connect the Ballard Estate to Fountain, which we now call the Firoz Shah Mehta Road. Uh, in in the middle of, say, a road like Muhammad Ali Road, you now have an intervention, planned intervention. So more new buildings are created along Muhammad Ali Road, which all have this new Art Deco style. So planning happens all over Bombay, but in a series of what I can call micro plans, not an overall image of the city changing or an overall development plan of the city for the future. That actually starts from the 1960s. But in terms of interventions, yes, there are a lot of interventions, and these are all planned interventions.
Mustansir, the reason also I asked this question was sure there were micro planning this, and I remember then when the city kept on moving north, there were also local town planning schemes, small ones, etc. So even today, as we come to say, you know, 90 years almost since Art Deco really flowered in this
90s,
city.
yes.
Even today, we have grand developmental plans which come up every 10 years, which take about 5 years to actually fructify. And then by that time it happens, the city has moved on and changed character. Do you think that somewhere along the way, and I'm asking now, moving away from this topic of Art Deco to the topic of the city, do you think that we have moved away somewhat from this concept of looking at the city as a whole and thinking in terms of where it should be, where it is, where it can go, where it should be? And, I'm not talking merely of zoning laws. I'm talking far bigger. So, do you think we've lost our way in that somehow?
Uh, yes, I mean, I think so, very much so. It is a matter of concern and a matter of distress, I would say. To me as an architect and, as an observer of the city and a, deep lover of Mumbai, of Bombay, to see something like this happening. What seems to have changed is our attitude to the ground beneath our feet, and that has percolated at almost every level of the city. Because in I think this began in the mid 90s and has continued now for right until the first quarter of the of the uh, of this century, and that is that the ground beneath our feet suddenly has potential of being monetized, and because of that, everyone has certain aspirations to take that ground and to monetize it. Doing this has in fact changed radically our association with our own city, which was one of deep loyalty to the place that we lived in, to the communities that we were around. And we had this, at least I remember this, you will remember this, that we had this attitude that we could take our city for granted. It was the backdrop to our lives. It allowed us to flourish. It allowed us to live a very lovely life. And it was relatively or it was relatively unchanging or slowly transforming in a pace that we could all accept. But the whole notion of looking at land beneath our feet as an exchangeable quantity has brought in tremendous and very, very fast change in the city of Mumbai. And it has also made architecture, which is something we thought was important to us, especially as the backdrop to our lives in which we lived, very ephemeral, in the sense that no sooner than a building comes up, one starts of redeveloping, one starts of thinking of redevelopment. So there is no stability, in a sense, in the architecture of the city that we grew up to love, and there is also no real sense of appreciation and protection of precincts of the city, where historically we had a lot of heritage, a lot of buildings. So you would have buildings, which were all neoclassical, or you would have buildings which were all Art Deco. And those were, we looked at fondly, as different parts of our history. Today, all those are pretty much open for grabs, to be changed, to be merged, to create large buildings. And the individual, variety of this city is being very quickly homogenized. And that
No, no,
is
I'm glad you brought.
a source of grief. Yeah.
Yeah, no, of course, it's a source of grief, and I'm glad you brought up this up. So, do you think current Mumbai's Art Deco treasure, let's say Marine Drive, for example, or certain other areas, Shivaji Park, you know, do you think that Art Deco in a city which is characterized by that particular this? I mean, people think of Marine Drive as the symbol of what Bombay is. Do you think that is under threat?
It is under intense threat. I would put it this way. even though it has got a brief respite with this UNESCO nomination, which means that the buildings along the Oval Maidan and the buildings along Marine Drive, they form part of this UNESCO nomination. But it is just one building away from being destroyed, in the sense that one of the most wonderful things about the Art Deco period was that we had these beautiful precincts and with these beautiful streets, which had a lot of buildings that were largely self similar, and each building was different in its own way, but together you could see certain urban harmonies, which we see when we look at Marine Drive, or we see when we look at the Oval Maidan, or it used to be in the case of the Shivaji Park, and so on. Okay, if these are not seen together, then there is no real future. You cannot preserve, and I've commented on this earlier, you cannot preserve Bombay's heritage, Mumbai's heritage, just by preserving individual buildings. You have to be able to preserve groupings, precincts, neighborhoods, and streets if you want to preserve heritage. And I say it is just one building away from being destroyed. Take the case of the Oval Maidan, which is very beautifully preserved today, primarily due to the intervention of its inhabitants who formed an association and lobbied for it. Just change one building from there to one of the builder type buildings today, and the entire precinct is lost. The same thing applies to Marine Drive, and the same thing sadly has begun to happen to Shivaji Park. So would you go to Shivaji Park today and look around and call it an Art Deco, paradise? I doubt it. But we have the Marine Drive still, and we have the Oval Maidan still as examples where this still remains.
But a future generation may not actually know what Marine Drive was. I'm talking about way into the future. So, therefore, again, whole series of steps. I mean, heritage is a very, it can be an emotional topic also for various reasons. And we have to also consider, whether we like it or not, the sentiments of the residents. So those things do apply. But for the moment, we have Marine Drive, we have Oval, we have Churchgate, we have Shivaji Park, and pockets like Matunga and other places. So there is this festival going on in conjunction with Miami, which also has its own Art Deco. Uh, and both of these are I use it in quotation marks, tropical deco of a particular weather pattern. Uh, why is it, firstly, is it enjoying a revival, at least in terms of interest of the younger generation? And two, if it is, why is it so?
Before I answer that, I must also say that even a place like Miami is under threat in a variety of ways, not very different from what is happening in Mumbai. But yes, I would suggest that there is a revival and there is an interest. It is very much, the flavor of the season today. We are right in the middle of a festival which is celebrating 100 years of Art Deco. And Mumbai has a whole bunch of events which are happening, right from heritage walks to visits to buildings to jazz and food cultures to, soirees where you come dressed in the costumes of the 30s and so on. And there is a symposium on Art Deco which is to happen tomorrow, as a matter of fact, in the Bhaudaji Lard Museum. So all that is very much there. There is an exhibition which I would recommend people to visit, which has been curated by Art Deco Mumbai, which is one of the signature organizations documenting as many Art Deco buildings in the city as possible. And they have already crossed 1,500 buildings, which they have documented. I must say, and I'm very proud to say, that I am a trustee of Art Deco Mumbai, uh, and this exhibition is something I would definitely recommend people to come and see, to see the comparisons, similarities, and differences between Miami and Mumbai. So yes, it is very much the flavor of the season. It has been in the limelight in the wake of not in the wake in the run up to the UNESCO nomination, and since then it has always been in the limelight right until today. I hope it remains. One of the good things that is happening is the value of heritage and heritage preservation, at least at the level of the material culture of our city, is a subject that is being picked up, appreciated. You have a large number of younger uh, enthusiasts who are coming to the fore and talking about this and appreciating it. Uh, do you know how I come to know this, Siddharth? One of the wonderful things you will find is there are a whole bunch across India, a whole bunch of Instagram pages on Art Deco buildings all over the country.
I know.
And each one is run by enthusiasts, essentially, not necessarily specialists, but they are doing this stellar job of documenting buildings which we had not seen before. They are all coming together in this. So you have Art Deco Delhi and Art Deco Pune and Art Deco Chennai and Art Deco Hyderabad, and you name it. There are Instagram pages. These are the people keeping the heritage alive, and they are also keeping Art Deco as you know uh, uh, being talked about today. And I really appreciate that. So we need alternative means, by which to keep the conversation going. I hope that in fact the state, which is the government, state government, central government, they appreciate these things as well and bring in a little more strong legislation to preserve this heritage. But at present, it looks like you know it's an open house for converting land to real estate.
So actually, there is definitely an element of pessimism as far as that is concerned, especially in this city. But I think that's an ailment that affects cities elsewhere too. Looking at every bit of open space, available space, or even occupied space as monetizable. But since you did talk about these Instagram pages, and I'm sure that Instagram pages in some places also translate into, let's say, people getting together, going for walks, etc. So there is a long shot, but there is some kind of hope that there could be micro pressures to the state to say, do something, please. It's not enough
Yeah,
for UNESCO to step in. It has to be much more than that.
I
So,
agree.
and in which, of course, owners, landlords, everyone has to play their own part. But the city has to play a very big part. So, again, I do hope uh, Mumbai's Art Deco legacy is keeps doesn't get completely destroyed over the next few decades. But thank you, Mustansir, for explaining this. What is a kind of, in quotes, buzzword so cogently to our listeners. I hope your your overt pessimism in some areas doesn't come true. So that was, thank you. Uh,
Thank you. I hope so too. And I hope that, we have this lovely city with a lot of built heritage. It remains that way for all of us to enjoy, you know, in the time to come as well.
that was Mustansir Dalvi, academic, architect, teacher of architecture, poet, and many more things, but also a lover of Art Deco and a great fighter for it. Speaking to us about Mumbai's Art Deco heritage. We'll be back once again next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye.